Hello, everybody. This is the sixth pandemic lecture at the IUC. Tom Ferguson will talk today about industrial structure and social conflicts in the age of COVID-19. Briefly, Tom has been with us at the IUC for many years, teaching to our students. After obtaining his PhD from Princeton University, Tom has taught at the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and in other prestigious institutions. He is now Emeritus Professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Professor Ferguson is Director of Research at the New York Institute of New Economic Thinking. And he's also he has been a senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. Tom, you have the floor.
All right, thank you. A virtual floor I have never had before, but I am glad to have it. I'm very happy to be able to talk to people at the IUC, though there is inevitably an element of nostalgia here because I thought I was going to be there now. Whereas it is perfectly obvious, it seems to me, that's not going to happen for a good long while. So I thought somebody needed to think sort of very generally about what's happening in Western developed societies, about what's the meaning of everything that's happening to us. I mean, this is like a giant avalanche that suddenly hit us that almost nobody really anticipated. Although discussions of pandemics had been on especially in the US and Britain, had been sort of widely discussed in policy circles since at least the Second Gulf War. But this is actually a very interesting point. In both the UK and the US, it turns out there were fairly extensive preparations made, but under the impact of when the Conservatives won the election after the great financial crisis and introduced austerity, nearly all of those measures that had been taken were sort of just budgeted away over time. And in the US, they didn't budget them away so much as the restructuring of medical care, especially propelled by things like financial takeovers by private equity in particular, though not exclusively, in the medical sphere, led to models of health that said basically an excess hospital bed, if you have it around, is something you don't want to have. It's all got to pay out. Anyway, what I begin with the usual disclaimer. I'm not talking for anything that I'm connected with. That's my own views. And now let me get down to the next. No. I confess to a there. Okay, I managed to do it. All right. What I want to discuss today is, how come these political parties are taking different positions on responses? And we know there's some variation in this across countries. But, basically, as far as I can tell, pretty much everywhere, the first response was, we don't believe it. This can't quite be happening. But it was affected by local economic situations. In particular, the countries near China often locked down much faster, saving a lot of grief. On the other hand, and I think Italians hardly need any reminder on this, nobody canceled big sporting events, ski resorts. I mean, the ski crisis in Austria affected Sweden, Italy, a whole string of other places. And eventually, policy had to change because the enormity of the situation became apparent. Now, of course, what is really interesting to study is how parts of the government function almost super efficiently, waiving a few details. I actually think, in retrospect, advocates of strong, perfect market foresight views are not going to look so great on this crisis, because I think people should have seen it some weeks earlier. than they did. But now that's a detail. It is obviously the case that when financial markets started to freeze up, the financial regulators moved very rapidly. It's not news. You all know this. The Fed supplied dollars on a colossal scale. And then very quickly, in countries with an independent central bank, you can see the central bank and the Treasury, the finance ministries, as we would say in Italy, usually then turn out to be jointly managing things. I mean, there are all these arguments in economic theory about why you should really unify the balance sheets of the central bank and the government. Well, you got something very close to that, even in reality. And the US Fed has obviously led the way. Everybody knows the European Central Bank is slower, but the Bank of England's done a lot too. Now, an interesting detail on this is that if you look closely in the Eurozone, you can see that the bailout leadership is more country-centered. And I think this is going to be a huge problem for the Eurozone over time. And it is clear that right within the first few days as this financial panic hit, every country quickly made a decision, I think pretty much the same, waiving some differences, especially in the health sector. They weren't going to do anything like war economies or things like that. By war, I mean something like what the most economies did in World War I or World War II, with a heavy share of government management. The general decision was, we're going to stick with neoliberalism, and we will channel intervention through existing firms. In the health sector, you couldn't do that, and obviously they didn't. Now, as I want to look at what happened and why. And I begin with the usual cautions. I mean, the IUC is, first of all, an academic institution. And so I got to spell out here what the problems. The first thing is, it's just shockingly difficult to sort of get a handle on the statistical side of just about anything in the health business. It's totally amazing. Countries don't count even their COVID-19 deaths the same. That's partly because testing is patchy. But there's also nursing home deaths, which are huge in almost every country, are often not counted. It really varies across countries. And they're unreliable. Now, that's in part because, I'm sorry to say, a point that is rarely made in public, which is, it's clear in the US, there is now a good study by the Associated Press that shows this. A lot of people who got really sick were sent by hospitals to the nursing homes. It's not just a question. I mean, there is lots of people have observed how low wages and bad working conditions, if you like, precarious economic circumstances of people who take care of people in nursing homes is quite widespread. This is not just the problem, though. I mean, there's really a kind of hospital pipeline problem in many countries. The other problems, though, are not as they're worse, actually, which is that an unsympathetic being like myself would say, mass deception has clearly happened on a large scale. I mean, the do masks protect fiasco, I think, is the simplest and easiest thing to understand. When this panic hit, when the pandemic hit, we were told repeatedly, well, masks, you don't really need masks. They won't really protect you. Now, virtually everybody has changed their line. It is perfectly clear why governments and healthcare specialists went on about this. It's because they didn't have any. And they didn't have any because in most cases they'd outsourced the production of these things to just a few places in the developing world, and they weren't available. I mean, the mask story, along with similar things. You don't have this problem in Germany, but elsewhere you have problem with ventilators and a lot of other equipment. It's going to lead to a rethinking about what the real costs of globalization are. That's already underway. And the governments report statistics often in the most grotesque, highly political ways. This is bad even in normal times. But it's clear, for example, that many countries do the best they could to drag their feet on recognizing who's got how many cases of COVID they've got. And of course, it's all in many, though not all countries, testing is very, very patchy. Okay, when we come to the bailout, we don't have to worry whether you're making some misjudgment. The US legislative drafters of the so-called CARE Act, it's a bipartisan story, by the way, both Republicans and Democrats, they decided on the advice of former Federal Reserve officials, not least, that they would like to keep most of the details of the bailout secret. That was a big fight in 2008, 9, 10. And eventually some of that secrecy was pierced fairly well, and a lot of people looked fairly either stupid or venal. That was, while they said they did it so they could get around open meeting laws, in fact, the question to ask is, why do they have to get around open meeting laws? The answer is they think it's unpresentable. And then, of course, the great power conflicts here. The US and China is a clear-cut case, but there are more, and we'll be talking about them later. Anyway, so my approach to this is somewhat different from anything I've seen. I very much appreciated Joseph Halaby's lecture last week, and I agree with him that countries able to produce their equipment to test and things like that probably have come through this. But I actually think one needs to sort of focus very sharply on one issue, and it's the worker safety issue. It's not the bailout issue. I'm no fan of the way bailouts are being done, and we can talk about those. But if you want to understand the real politics of this, I think it's worker safety. And the question is, how are the risks parceled out by public policy across social groups? Now, I just threw in the remark about the value of a statistical life approach. That's the standard. It's often used by sort of neoclassical welfare economics folks, though you're not necessarily wedded to that approach. But we're not talking here about valuing all lives the same. I want to know how people get sorted out into categories. This is a social class story, in other words. In particular, look, here are some facts. In the US, I know in the UK, because I read the British papers, and elsewhere, hospital staff were frequently dismissed or threatened, particularly near the start of the epidemic in each country. There were, in the US, we had cases where, since they were being told not to wear masks, because mostly people didn't have enough, and not to alarm people by giving them the idea that masks might help them, nurses were being threatened when they showed up with their own masks. And frankly, it's not clear to me how far these problems, I think, are not necessarily solved at all. We'll come back to that. The government safety agencies just string out on a continuum. The US, on almost every one of these, is going to be at one end. You know, someplace in Northern Europe, Nordics or something, will of course be on the other. But you're also got labor relations issues and local law enforcement, where in pandemics, it's clear that large numbers of people have been profiteering in certain things, notably face masks. I haven't read of any prosecutions on this. I'm also not happy to report that not just in the US, but elsewhere, exactly what unions are doing all of this on this issue is not clear to me. I have made direct inquiries, and I know a lot of folks. In some cases, we see them sort of actively involved. In other cases, no. This is going to become very important. In Italy, I know the trade unions have been often very involved. That's something of an exception. And a lot of center-left parties, when I quiz Social Democratic Party members or officials in the Northern European countries, say, well, we're really interested in taxes or spending. They're not necessarily talking too much about worker safety. And the migrant workforces clearly are, I think, often very much left out. Now, so I'm going to just walk you through this. Now, But I begin, as usual, by just explaining a few general things. You want to be sure what's not driving public policy here. And what's not driving public policy are basically electoral calculations. Governments will look at, if they're way down in the polls, they'll pay some attention, though not always. Now, you can all say, hey, that's a special US case. No, it is not. Most polls in most countries show that the public has pretty deep concerns about public safety, and in particular about rapid reopening. There are some higher trust countries, the Netherlands maybe, where a little less effective, but a lot of the polling is not wonderful here. Moreover, it's clear to me you could get very different answers if you gave people alternative frameworks. I was reading one in Thuringia this morning in the German press. And Thuringia is a place where in German history, a lot of bad things start. And there you could see some fairly clear generational clashes, it was said, but I actually think it reflected the structure of the poll. Anyway, so I'm going to just ask you to accept reality. Median voters, that 51st voter in a row of 100, are just not driving the outcomes. And bailouts for big business aren't popular. It's fun to see which countries will even pull on this. And the answer is not many are. So let's not focus on that. So I want to go back to first principles. This investment approach to party competition. In other words, look at the interest groups. Now, I'm going to use this to arrive at a quick generalization about how COVID changes the structure of party politics. And my views, I've got a lot of friends around there, but there's no reason why you ever have to pay any attention to anything I said or did. But the bottom line on this is where labor interests are weak or disorganized, you're going to see more and more power pass into the hands of investor groups. And you can do this empirically, actually, though hardly anybody does it. Most social scientists will do anything to avoid studying this. And I used to get lots of, my colleagues, Paul Jorgensen, G. Chen, and I produced some strong evidence that as a group, when you have hundreds of elections in parliamentary elections, our House of Representatives or the Senate, where you have only 100, you get an almost linear model of outcomes between the split on political money and the partisan vote between the two major parties. People said that was weird. It must be just, for a while they thought it was driven by another variable like popularity. We showed it wasn't, because we could finally do an instrumental variable that was a good one for that. And then folks said, well, that's the US, it's pathological. Well, in France, when somebody ran the study, they got the same linear model results. That's another lecture though. And so I'm going to assume that actually you can analyze these things empirically. And if you can't think of any other way to do it, you can do it by so-called event analysis. I am delighted to say that there is an Italian researcher finally doing the who's in and who's out of the P2 Lodge and its effects when those things were revealed back, what was it now, 40 years ago or so, using that method. Anyway, so here's my big generalization. COVID hits everybody, everywhere. Think of it as a dark snow. This ought to reach to Italians who, as far as I can tell, except when you go skiing, you probably hate snow. It slows everything down. If you get 2 feet of snow, dropping on you, this happens, I regret to say, and where I live more often than I like, it's just a huge pain to do anything. But look, in that situation, what it means is the people who can bear the costs, big money and organized interest groups, are the folks who get a bigger advantage. Bailouts compound that because the structure of bailouts is often not really sort of thought through consistently. I mean, the Ed Keynes stuff and Bessler and Schurz, 2 folks from the Austrian National Bank, fine paper on the INET website, there, just show you the basic structure of these bailouts is you bail out the people who have wealth, and in return, country might make varying efforts to maintain the incomes of the citizens. You can't do that, and then you repeat this game these days in a globalized financial system. Now it would appear about every 10 years, but you know, we'll all find out. You can, I think, reasonably say that COVID came from the outside, was exogenous in a way that 2008 was not. On the other hand, the impacts of these bailouts, once they start to occur, they're not exogenous at all. They're really system driven. Anyway, so my conclusion is that COVID briefly, for a while, till ordinary people can figure out workarounds, it's a time machine, puts you back into the real Gilded Age, where most of us had any trouble getting anything heard. I also think I see very clearly that media follows power, and government bureaucracies, and especially the justice system, do. It's like you can just feel the sort of, if you like, popular oxygen ebbs out of the system for a good long while. You could say it's an incredible shrinking public space, which I think is true. I mean, you know, the basic way ordinary citizens often get power is they got to go have a public meeting or something. Well, try doing that with COVID. I mean, I know people are doing it. They're doing it everywhere. In Germany and the US, there may be a kind of negative Darwinism in those. Anyway, so I'm going to sort of take basically then political money and interest groups are what we want to study. And now I want to just take one look at how the various countries have coped. Now, I hope you can see this. This is basically developed countries. And what we got there, Spain, Ireland, Belgium, US, Italy, UK, high up. Sweden and the Netherlands fairly high up. You know, the Swedish case we'll come back to. Early on, they said this was going to be some new wonderful way that wasn't lethal and wouldn't harm the economy. Well, they're not doing so well. And then you got a few countries at the bottom. Now, those are mostly close to Asia. The case of Greece, it has sometimes been said it was rapid response. You can ask Yanis Varoufakis, who's after all the next speaker here, what he thinks of the Greek data. I would like to see more discussion, though I did consult some other statistical sources, but we'll leave it. In any case, here's the sort of big story. There's one outlier. That's Belgium. Now, the question is, why is Belgium out there? There's no real doubt about this. They have aggressively pursued a policy of actually trying to count virtually every case, and been trying to do the nursing homes too. The health guy responsible for the health count actually got into a public discussion across the Atlantic with President Trump at one point. Otherwise, what you see is, I think, this, except for Sweden and the Netherlands, these other countries are pretty strongly oriented toward laissez-faire. The Swedish case is extremely interesting because we all think of Sweden as, high social protection, though if you're familiar with the dynamics of that system, that's been whittled away a lot. And what Bide and Pagrotsky show you is that, boy, the healthcare and nursing home section, they were early on deregulated, and that's where they've had huge trouble. So I'm going to assume as a fact, stylized fact, that the association of laissez-faire and high death rates is pretty strong. A point I'll want to come back to is that, in fact, it's not like countries that have avoided strong lockdowns have got much better economic outcomes. In fact, quite the reverse. This whole question, I think, is going to look a little weird. Anyway, the point I want to make right now is that in all these countries, the lockdowns were heavily opposed by many business interests. The Swedish case is interesting. One poll, I don't feel the need to go through all of my slides in detail here. The point is that early on, there was a lot of talk about especially in conservative circles, and especially in business circles, and I can tell you, I know I am not guessing here, even in some central bank circles, I'm not saying everybody, there's a lot of talk about we really should do herd immunity. The Dominic Cummings case in the UK is well known. There was some talk, attributed quotes about this might even be useful to reduce pension pressures. People are certainly thinking about that, but exactly whether, I don't need to get into the question of whether the news reports were true. The talk about herd immunity, the UK case is extremely important because there's an awful lot of good statistics there and a lot of folks keyed on it. And that Imperial College model projected enormous numbers of deaths. And there are a bunch of rival models. There's an Oxford model. There's a whole string of others. But anyway, here's the point. They did change policy. Even Cummings changed policy, according to the London Times. And then, however, massive business pressures formed to do a quick exit from the lockdown. I quote from my favorite piece on that right there. Now, the case of the United States is, well, it's attracted world attention because it's been so disastrous. That has led some folks to wonder whether President Trump really favors herd immunity. That assumes that he holds, fixed ideas long enough to be characterized. I don't get into psychology. I think the folks who try to armchair psychologize leadership are mostly just doing garbage. What is clear is that there have been steady business pressures, many of them from strong supporters of the president, a lot of them from private equity. I'll just go rapidly through this. No real doubt that the sort of business pressures have been overwhelmingly to get open quickly. There's also, there are demonstrations in the US on a fairly large scale, as in some other countries. There's a good deal of reasons for thinking that's not the grassroots, but what people sometimes call astroturf. There. The polls show overwhelming support for slow reopening. And a point I want to make, because if you're actually trying to explain this, understanding the story on political money is extremely helpful. Back when the 2016 election happened, my colleagues and I, Paul Jorgensen and Ji Chen, our statistical studies of who contributed showed you the importance of private equity, which is generally extreme laissez-faire. These are folks who buy up firms and generally break them up. Those folks were key in the final stages of the Trump campaign. They also played a huge role in saving the Senate for the Republicans in 2016. Now I want to analyze this story because this is really crucial for where we're all going. In my view, the campaign to end lockdowns is basically a bunch of white-collar execs, I would add men and women, who can work at home insisting that blue-collar workers should take risks they shouldn't. Now, people have actually tried to work through how many jobs can be done fairly easily at home. I'm a little less impressed by the sort of white versus blue collar dichotomy being home, done at home versus not done at home, because it's clear that some outdoor, transitory, indoor jobs, especially in construction, I think will not fit that. That can be very important. Here is a point that is true, but is not reported hardly anywhere. There's just no question that construction unions in some countries have been quietly urging rapid opening. That's a fact, I think, in the US, though one has to sort of operate, you can't point to almost anything written on this. Then there are, I also think that in the next years, assuming there's no vaccine, big assumption, obviously, some white collar jobs may be turning into what I call information age blue collar positions. And, for folks at IUC, and, many of you are academics, well, that's us. And some parts of healthcare will certainly share features of this, but healthcare has been known for ages to be potentially dangerous, though not, I think, on the scale that we're now talking about. Anyway, and as we look, so now we've got really big trouble, and we've got big political conflicts over how fast do you reopen? And it's extremely interesting to study what people's proposals are for dealing with this. In the US, is a particularly gross case because we've got a lot of new firms of various types. If you're looking for an information age economy, the US has certainly, got a big one. The Chinese case is very interesting, not one I want to discuss today. But otherwise, the rest of the planet, partial exception of the British, are out of it. That's going to be a big issue in the future. Anyway, you can see that a lot of high-tech companies are small ones mostly, though. They're promoting testing as a solution to this problem. And the problem with these, all the tests right now, they're all over the place. In the US, they're largely unregulated. I'm unclear what the regulatory situation is elsewhere, but I can't believe it's that good. And all the ones that I've read of that are seriously studied, they produce a lot of false positives and false negatives. In other words, they'll either tell you you're okay or that you're not okay and you're really okay. We all know about contact tracing. Apple and Google have one which they say will not allow you to trace, not a centralized system. There is massive pressure from governments to have a centralized system. Some other parts of the industry, I think, prefer that. There's an enormous controversy in Germany over this, where large numbers of folks in the industry said, look, this is just a surveillance state, which is indeed, if you have a centralized system, this is a potential problem. The other side of it is who's going to own the data. That's a really critical question, and it's not getting enough attention because huge numbers of firms want to get into that data and sell it or use it. In particular, the pharmaceutical companies, but many other folks see that they can do all kinds of things with that data. I read in the British papers that the National Health Service apparently did a deal with some Silicon Valley type firms. And then it's fun to watch, in a sick sense, watch the various pharmaceutical firms. Sometimes they'll produce symptomatic relief. Sometimes they'll try to push vaccines, others treatments. The vaccine question is obviously going to be a political football that really needs careful attention because the question about pricing and the status of the patents, most drugs in the US, we know, are produced, as Bill Lazonick and his colleagues have emphasized for years, they're produced by government subsidies first, usually through the National Institute of Health or something, and only later gets spun out to the private sector. Private sector tends to then grab all the returns, and often in ways that seem to the rest of us outrageous. Anyway, so where does this leave us? Well, what it says is we got lots of blocks potentially forming here. Let's take a look, first of all, at sort of the way basic social class conflicts develop. Essentially, so a string of research that I've promoted as the research director at INET, from Lance Taylor, Peter Temin, Sarbash Storm, Bill Lazonick, and others. They're developed country economies are all becoming dual economies to varying degrees. Obviously, in Europe, this varies hugely. But what you got here are reverse Lewis. Now, if that's a term that's weird, it's reverse W. Arthur Lewis. Lewis had people moving in modernization out of, low productivity jobs in the countryside to cities where there are higher productivity. This process works in reverse, though not necessarily moving people all out of cities. And you often don't have benefits, sick pay, health insurance, or unemployment. To the extent in countries that those are weak, COVID economics is going to become nightmares for a precarious workforce. And I think particularly for migrants, where there's been trouble everywhere in Germany, in the US, migrant policy. I would add here, now this I come to, what's really wrong with a lot of the thinking about the design of bailouts is just, well, look, just handing cash out. The line in the US was we were going to do it to preserve jobs. Many have said that elsewhere. Now, it's turning out that what in some countries, as in Germany, you go on Kurzarbeit, but then it turns out that in the upper jobs that the employer will often make up some of your losses. The lower folks don't have that. That's even showing up in German public opinion polls. And in the US, it is perfectly obvious that most companies that took bailouts, no matter what was said there, have taken the money, but you just have to look at the US unemployment rate. The real rate is probably around at 25% right now. That's the U6 rate if you're really into the technical details, not U3. A large numbers of people have just dropped out of the US workforce, particularly older workers, and so they don't count in these statistics that are admittedly already, anyway, staggering. Anyway, bottom line here is what we need to do is if you want to get anywhere and not just have a cat fight all the time, what you need to do to move on to the public balance sheet, the state, are the costs associated with safely redesigning work. Otherwise, if you just pour money into the firms, they keep it and then they fight with the workforce. I don't actually think that most businesses, and especially most smaller businesses, they don't actually want to kill their workforce or their customers. And the customer one will certainly put them out of business. But if you don't assist with the costs of redesigning production, they'll cut corners, dig in, and fight, the changes you need. And you obviously need much stronger whistleblowing laws because you're just not having enough whistles blown. You can't rely on the press to sort of find out stuff. And if they do find out stuff, you can't rely on the local law enforcement authorities, I think pretty much anywhere, to necessarily do anything. In the US, Mike Elk has a, what's he call it, Payday, a site where he's been, let me go back to this so I keep you focused on the point just for a second, wildcat strikes. You're not reading about these in the newspapers nearly as much as you are reading about the so-called right-wing demonstrations to do a rapid lockdown. But there are more than 200 wildcat strikes verifiably around in the US. He plots them on his website. This is a very interesting situation. Okay, but there is more to be said. It so happens by several authors have noticed that a good deal of Silicon Valley, not everybody, this is a very tricky question, was cranking up for a campaign for US government aid before the coronavirus hit. They were using Chinese competition as the rationale. Now, what these folks did when they saw the coronavirus is they refashioned the appeals to emphasize how much they could help rescue the US from the pandemic. They'll be coming to Europe, if they're already there in some cases, with the same pitch. In that sense, you can see very clearly that some interest groups are forming for a big change in government policy having to do with, if you like, economic dynamics. Moreover, these firms mostly don't run on low wages, though there are exceptions. Amazon is a kind of split level case. I mean, a big chunk of its revenue comes from the cloud, which is not a particularly labor intensive place to do business. But on the other hand, the massive logistics business uses vast amounts of labor, and they had one very senior executive quit in protest over what he regarded as the firm's lack of interest in worker safety. So a few final reflections here. I've said to you, wildcat strikes are multiplying in the US. I have seen a particularly interesting case to look at is the meat industry, though Denmark's turns out to be different. They use apparently more robots, but in Germany, they've had strikes. Many use migrants. Anytime you've got migrants, the question of where they're living is a huge problem. And in the, if I may speak of them as dorms in a non-technical sense, dorms are clearly rife. They're like student dorms in a situation. If you've got an epidemic going, this is a problem. Now, so just if you take a step back though, and then look at the even bigger context, the international situation, with a quite different story than in 2008-9. The great power friction was around there, but it's just not the same thing. I don't need to tell any of you in Europe that the Trump administration's America First campaign is not endearing it to anybody. I mean, this is not a policy that lots of us support. I don't, for example. But it's the policy. And U.S. relations with China have gone steadily downhill, not, I think, exclusively because the Americans behaved badly, and I'm not claiming that. Interestingly now, though, is that after you get past the first shock of, oh God, how do we keep this thing going? Shall we reopen? Then everybody's starting to talk about, well, what are we going to do about recovery? Because exactly as Joseph said, Alabi last time, very nicely, this is a double shock. It's a supply shock, but it immediately turns into a demand shock. And so you're going to have policies that work on both ends, if you like. I am a little skeptical of how the European Union manages this. My take is that, as I hinted at earlier, the recovery in the EU, since you don't have a unified central bank and finance ministry, it's getting led by the countries. And all of you know, I do not need to explain to Italians why, say, Germany is in a stronger position and how that has affected debates over what to do about the crisis. We've spent a fair amount of time at INET looking at that. We have some very nice pieces by Italians, Anna Maria Seminazzi, Antonella Storati, and others on this question. But I think the question of what happens in Europe is a potential problem. But frankly, the atmosphere between the great powers right now is really pretty terrible. And you're not seeing the kind of G7 or G20 coordination you saw in the wake of the financial crisis, where almost immediately there was an agreement, okay, we won't allow any more Lehman Brothers. And then there was, I think, that Toronto agreement where they said we might expand for a bit. That did not hold very well. It didn't last long, but you don't, right now, you don't have really things like that. And I actually think you can see some, at times, it looks to me like exchange depreciation policies just sort of were promoted early on. Now everybody's close to zero. So, I mean, you can go lower, though what you get for that is very unclear to me. And where this is going to cause real trouble, I suspect, too, is in the emerging market debt problems. You've got, it's not just Argentina, there's a whole bunch of middle-income countries. I don't need to remind you about Turkey. That's right on the border in Europe. But there's plenty more, Indonesia, wherever. And compounded in some cases by the oil collapse of oil prices, although for other countries that's a big boost. But the point is simply, if you're seeing anything like international economic coordination to solve emerging market debt problems, point it out to me. I mean, the people have been fighting about a special drawing rights issue. The U.S. was opposed. China favored it. It hasn't happened, and in any case, the amount isn't enough, 500 billion or whatever they were talking about. I'm too polite to note the possibility that German domestic politics might yet blow up the whole Eurozone. Since Peter Temin and I wrote several papers on 1931, this is not happening because, authoritarians in Germany were trying to take over or something. This is not, that was happening then. It's not happening now. But German domestic politics is again stuck on the question of how it's going to relate to European-wide issues. And so the whole thing could go down the tubes. So where I come out on this, I'm sorry to say, is let's hope everybody develops a vaccine. Otherwise, if you want a happy ending, my standard pitch, which is see a Disney movie, is unfortunately the only thing I have to recommend it. I don't like what we're seeing here. On this note, I'm happy to answer questions. I think I've actually done almost exactly what I was asked to speak for, 49 minutes.
Thank you, Tom, for this punctual and detailed analysis. So the floor, as you say, is open to opinions and questions. Who wants to go first?
Okay, can I ask a question?
Please do, Jan.
Jan,
Yes.
of course.
Now, Tom, I wondered whether you've noticed any difference in the policies of, let's say, right-wing or conservative governments and left-wing or left-leaning governments, or is it all kind of much the same and it's really responding to events rather than being in control of them?
All right, I like the question, and I sort of probably should have said something about this, but your first situation is, where are we to find relatively left-wing governments in power? There, at best, you have right coalitions in Germany, for example. But unless I do not take seriously the Macron claim to have, transcended that distinction, and the left wing just broke away on him, though it's split in two ways. And that wasn't, let us say, probably the real left wing at all. Let's face it, we're not looking where the menu of obvious, people, if you want to think of this as a sports team, you'd have a hard time finding a distinctively left jersey. On the other hand, I do think the embedded character of, if you like, past policies does matter. It is clear to me that, almost every form of supervision, worker safety issues, and even unionization, even despite a substantial erosion in places like Germany, it's just very different from the United States. I mean, OSHA, the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, part of the Labor Department, has been almost moribund by design under the Trump administration. And while there have been some lawsuits and a few verbal promises, man, I'll believe it when I see it. So I'm not seeing a huge amount. I am somewhat unhappy, frankly. I think the major left parties, at least have probably not paid enough attention either to the design of the bailout, and I'm pretty sure they haven't paid enough attention to migrant labor issues, but I think just in general, I don't quite understand why everybody swallows the noise about reopening universities. Now you can, as quietly as they have so far. I am watching some research on this. We may publish some of it. It's not mine. I have nothing to do with the research, but I've been reading statistics pretty soon. And I think the chance, it looks to me like fears that at least people over 20 or so can easily reinfect themselves. I'm unclear what I think about the kindergarten and lower grade statistics. I've seen papers going both ways on this. But the above age 20, I think the evidence is pretty strong that you can reinfect. In that respect, all these talks about U or V-shaped recoveries, I'm expecting sort of W-shaped recoveries, where you know, it's a kind of disastrous, not necessarily disastrous, depends how fast you react, difference equation or something, where you know, you reinfect, you lock down a bit more, etc. This is the type of cycle I fear you're gonna generate. And there, I think the policy, I think basically, I'll just come out and say, I think that the social democratic parties and the left parties have been a little asleep on some of this, though they are aware of the issues. And they haven't. It's not like anybody's totally fallen down on the job or something, though I do not understand some of the discussion in some German states where the left party seems to be favoring a wide open business. I gotta see this.
Can
Okay.
I ask you? Can I ask a question, please?
Of course.
Do-
Yes. Hi to everybody. This is Ugo. I have basically a couple of issues here that I would like you to address briefly. First of all, I think there are quite substantial indirect costs on keeping intellectual institutions such as universities closed, in keeping kids away from physical socializing, out of unsubstantiated fears for possible returns of the virus. I think we just simply know too little to make that kind of claim that because there is a risk in the future that things can get worse, then we should lock ourselves and stop being active and participating. And this is something that to me is really, I did my own presentation in this series a few weeks ago, and that's the work I'm doing now. It seems to me that this is a transformation of citizens into patients that is going on. And it's extremely costly from the point of view of any way to create some collective intelligence to get out of a situation in which we simply accept capitalism as some sort of gift of God, you know, that is going to exist forever and go in and out in crisis after crisis. And we kind of, you know, basically try to save our asses while the society is falling apart. It seems to me that there is a huge importance in reconstructing politics in sense of participation, and you don't construct politics in terms of participation if you're scared about your life. This is something that, you know, many people died out of defending freedom against just their life, and I believe that there is something that has to be considered from that point of view. So this is one point I wanted to put about, you know, this kind of right versus left hypothetical, which it seems to me that doesn't teach much in terms of policy. Here, it's a matter of people that are concerned about constitutional rights and possibility to make transformative politics happen again, or people that basically accept that some sort of instituted power can decide just because it's in power that, you know, people at some point just stay home. And this is, to me, that's a problem. It's not a solution. The other question is has to do, in which I wanted a little bit, if you could think about, tell me something about that. Would you consider China on the left or on the right in your hypothesis? Because it seems to me that there is some sort of a I don't know if that's very clear if you observe it from the United States, but it seems to me that it comes out pretty clearly if you look at things from the peripheric or semi-peripheric countries, that China is actually, there is actually an issue of global leadership going on now. And the Chinese challenge in terms of capacity to attract followers from other countries is becoming quite serious, especially because there is a sense that the Western Bloc and capitalist countries have not been able to sustain at all a serious line on protection of individual freedoms and constitutional rights and privacy issues and stuff like that. In some sense, you know, once we just accepted the idea that decisions can be taken without much of a worry for personal individual rights to participate in political life, then you know, between China and everybody else, there is just a matter of pragmatic efficiency in handling the virus, and in terms of how they handled it, the Chinese did much better than the United States. So I'm wondering whether this is not something that should worry you, Tom.
All right, a couple of things. First, I got two sets of questions here, right? So I got to do first one, then the other. I agree with you that the costs of, you know, not having intellectual institutions like universities actually meeting are huge. And moreover, I agree that this creates a disastrous transformation in the public sphere. That was indeed very close to the beginning slide. That was the conclusion from the way costs get redistributed in coronavirus. That's exactly what I think. It's really serious. Now, the next question, though, is what do we do about it? And here, allow me to be blunt. I think we are on the verge of getting a much clearer answer to what happens when you reassemble people. I think you will see this thing transform empirically in the next 6 or 8 weeks. Though the problem here is it takes about 3 weeks to actually see results. If you have a mass infection, reinfection, it won't show for at least 2 weeks, usually. In this regard, I would observe like a paper just published out of the National Bureau of Economic Research on the Wisconsin election. There have been previous papers on this, but what they did is they looked at the primary, they looked carefully, and what they found is that holding that, that was at the time disputed whether they ought to go forward with the normal voting lines outside and inside. It was eventually forced to go on, and it now seems clear that there was a substantial reinfection from that. Other folks I know, they didn't write that paper, but they have been looking at that data too. We'll see. I think that is going to be, unfortunately, an extremely clear event type analysis. It's going to, with a really troubling lesson. I might be wrong. All this stuff is, you know, they're really correlational, but this is a case where you can really define the event well. It's not like reopening Texas, which is something that is so multidimensional, one hardly knows what to say. So and empirically, you know, we're going to find this one out, folks. I mean, you know, in the fall, it's clear that American universities, like British universities, are in a lot of financial trouble. They were mostly left out of the bailout. They got only some money for poor students. And many of them live by tuition. They also live on full freight foreign students, paying foreign students. They're clearly determined to reopen. This is either going to lead to a rise in infection or not. And it'll be, I think, relatively datable. So I think this is one, unfortunately, where I would just I would counsel a lot of caution until we see what the facts are. Now, on the Chinese situation, okay. First thing to be said, what do I think of China? Well, that's like asking me what I think of London. The answer is simple, only if I'd never been there. And, you know, I have. And so, you know, China is clearly highly authoritarian. It is also clear it's not a super centralized place in the way most people in the West imagine it. It's not a Chalmers-Johnson style. I mean, the whole story about the Chinese economic model is not running like the Chinese version of METI that my old friend Chalmers-Johnson, you know, beautifully described. And I don't take seriously claims that the whole thing is a giant, sort of highly centralized operation. That's not, I mean, this stuff works on grants out of localities and lots of other things to be said there. That said, the government toward its citizenry is highly authoritarian. That seems to me clearly correct. Now, a question about leadership. I also don't believe, I would like to see a better study of the numbers. The number of people claim to have the disease in Beijing strikes me as improbable. I'm not the only person with that, but I do not know what the facts are. And I am not going to try to settle those questions. Well, that's one I'm content to just wait for there. On the general question of Chinese versus America, so, well, first of all, it's obvious that if the US behaves the way it has, it can't lead anybody. America first is not a line that makes sense in an interdependent world, even though you need to pay attention to, like, can you make enough masks, ventilators, and things like that in your own country? Every country is going to be doing that That said, let's look, it's not so clear about the great success of how the Chinese model, if you like, is selling. One thing to notice is the way the US Fed has operated as the world lender of last resort. When you actually look at all those swap lines, which are, of course, the main vehicle for this. I mean, they gradually extended them to different countries. They started with 5, what they do, add about 9 more, and then they added a general facility, and anybody could show up for a T-bill if you were a central bank and get dollars. The heaviest user of that right now seems to be Japan, which is an extremely interesting point. And I don't see that changing. I think the Fed knows very well that it is cementing the position of the dollar, and it's not going to be supplanted anytime soon by anything there. I'm not telling you this is all wonderful for the world, though I think it has some benefits. It also has some costs. That's another discussion. The other side of it, on the Chinese, like the Americans and other countries that have developing country, that have grants or debts owed to them, there are some problems there. There have been efforts to argue by some of the indebted countries that, well, they really deserve a break on their debt. I'll be interested to see how the Chinese respond to that. I think this question is just up in the air. And I don't think that, I gather they will now try to impose let us say, a new law on Hong Kong. That seems to me that is not going to make the Chinese model appealing to anybody.
Thank you. There is a question by Avi Singh from New Delhi. Avi, you got the floor. Avi?
Evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, like you were here.
How are you? Sorry, fascinating discussion. I just want one very quick comment. I completely agree with you that public health or pharmaceutical supplies is almost become a national security issue now, whether you have enough masks or hydrochloroquine for whoever takes it, etc. But the questions I want to bring in are twofold. One, after failing to take a crash course in being in epidemiological studies, I had to sort of go back and say, all right, we're lawyers. I mean, I'm a lawyer. And how does one think as a lawyer about states of exception? Whether the state of exception is justifiable when declared by the executive, and what metrics do we measure? And my concern is that when we're looking at all this, we're not looking at it, and I don't see judiciary looking at it, I don't see people looking at it. They're looking at it from the efficacies of public health. They're looking at it from efficacies of measures to promote public health, but they're not looking at it vis-a-vis those efficacies versus the violation of the right to movement, the right to family, the right to work, the right to free speech, the right to assembly, all the rights that we have, which the states of exceptions take away. And all of those states of exceptions should be, and we've reiterated again and again, subject to scrutiny. And once we take away that though this state of exception is sacred and has been made sacred by a technocratic, diktat that this is the way to go, we must stay at home, we must, which may be right, it may be wrong. I see people disagreeing about that, but I'm not in that field. I'm in the field of questioning it using the mechanisms we have. And if we give away those mechanisms of questioning, those parameters of questioning, then can we come back and say those rights mean anything? So that's the first question. And secondly, I'll just respond to Ugo, which is the China-US issue they're looking at. I think we are underplaying the effect of on Western leadership, the fact that Western countries are the worst affected by the pandemic. There is an idea that the West knows how to solve problems, which is no longer holding the test of the pandemic. And this is creating a lot of confusion, because the idea is that the US and New York and London and Italy to a second degree, but France can't handle it, then are those countries really in a leadership which we should follow as a comparative examples in how we structure societies and how we solve problems in those societies?
All right. Well, all right, couple of comments. First of all, I'm not, I hope, being interpreted as endorsing every crazy form of lockdown that has been done in, 17, 20 different countries. I mean, I read when I was told that the Austria in Vienna wouldn't let children out into the parks, I thought they were out of their mind, frankly, was my take. And similarly, my sense is that in a fair number of places, the lockdowns have been overdone. I mean, when you get people being told, no, you can't go, your wife can't come home, or your spouse or your husband or something, one wants to say, has anybody here got any common sense? Moreover, I am extremely skeptical about authoritarian states anywhere, including in the US, the UK, France, or any place else. Stuff with no review strikes me as always asking for trouble. I mean, the only reason I think some of this stuff is tolerable at all right now is it's typically for a short period and a pretty well-defined circumstance. I would certainly not give you blanket endorsements of all lockdowns. I do think that the question of reopening needs very careful assessment. And as I've said, on the bailout stuff, it's just been crazily mishandled. I mean, it's clear what you need are, moving on to the public balance sheet. In other words, subsidized redesigns of work so that people can actually get back to work safely. I myself don't see any problem with a test that basically says, look, if you're telling blue collar workers to go back to work, if you wouldn't be willing to go back to work in those circumstances, don't tell them they have to do it either. I just don't see this. And right now, I mean, the major, if we were going to carry on a longer discussion of sectoral splits, I would say that there is a big, right now with the current design of bailouts and the normal existing ideological conditions, if you like, that you went into it, you got a big chunk of the business community that is counting on higher unemployment with lower wages to force people back to work under any conditions. That seems to me exactly what should not be allowed to happen by public policy. And, you know, since that, look, neoliberalism is not my idea of a good model for anybody, not for the West and not for the East. In that sense, I'm long past the question of should we all be following the West? Follow the West in what regard? I mean, that we're just, you know, I'm sorry, but that's sort of where I'm at. I would hate to be interpreted as proposing anything else. Now, Avi, I'm not sure I've directly addressed all of your concerns. Tell me if not. I know very well, I remember our dinner, for example, with you and your bride-to-be, and tell me if just come right back at me. I'm fine. I know you're not hostile.
No, I guess the question here is that, you know, my concern is the prism at which we're looking at problems and solutions. I'm trying to see, should we go back to basics, you know, and look at them from, if we're lawyers, constitutionalism, rights versus impingement of those rights, etc. Because we've been looking at it, all of them, as if we are public health professionals, rather than the tools that we are given in terms of how we think societies are structured and how problems are solved. There are a lot of problems in the world. We usually look at it from, you know, what rights do people have and what gets impinged, what is the value of laws coming in, how do public policies test against impingement of rights and certain things that we hold are fundamental to how societies are structured. So do we need to put the same test towards pandemic policies? Sorry if I'm re-asking the same.
No, well, it's fine to re-ask because that sharpens the thing. And I guess my answer to this is, look, I can see very plainly that if you do nothing but just continue existing trends, that's the real meaning of my slide about all of the self-interested proposals for fixing things proposed by these various sectors. Tech folks could easily turn you into a complete surveillance state. And moreover, they'll have a surveillance state in which they, maybe along with the government, own the data. I mean, and, or at least large chunks of it. Yeah, I think, look, and maybe another way of putting this is what you're really challenging me is this, is like, since I began my lecture by saying, let's try to summarize the big difference. This coronavirus business is a kind of dark snow that blocks ordinary people and, you know, normal human interactions far more than, if you like, organized and big money interest groups, that you've really now got to work on this. I agree with that. I completely agree. That strikes me for folks, hey, IUC has a strong legal tradition. That strikes me as a very good thing for people to think about.
Thank you, Tom. Any other questions? Otherwise, I would, you know, like to say something myself. We've been reading different studies, and these studies have, you know, different scenarios as a background, as a future, in a perspective. One study, Australian study, that made it to the first page of the Daily Telegraph last week, claimed that young people in, for instance, in university age, people in their early 20s, do not get infected so easily and do not transmit so easily that infection, you know. So the situation we have, and we can agree on that, is that there is a collapse in wealth, there is a collapse in employment, there is a collapse in civic liberties in many countries. Wouldn't you say that going ahead with the lockdown is unsafe and that by default we should try something else?
Would I say that by something else? No, I would do very careful cautious reopenings. And I don't actually think, my reading of the evidence, I have been working with a big block of statisticians for many weeks now on this, so I see a great amount of this. I'm not claiming I see everything, but I sure do see a lot from many countries. And my sense is that there isn't actually quite as much disagreement as it appears, though I myself am frustrated by, if you like, the way the varying focuses of various studies create some confusion. Look, I think within 2 or 3 months, we're going to learn a lot more because people are reopening just about everywhere. And we're going to learn a lot more about how rapidly this thing spreads and develops. Now, I think this Wisconsin election case that I just discussed is quite worrisome because that really does seem to be a clearly definable event, and you can see how it led to more infections and a substantial rise for a good long period. It could be wrong. There were enough people actually getting coronavirus in universities that I knew the American universities shut down, as did everybody else. I mean, they started teaching and then everybody came home. There were certainly students getting sick there. Of this, there are no doubts. I know there's a British paper out of Warwick University that got immediate attention from the British government on, well, maybe we could just isolate older folks. I doubt it. I'm looking at the age profile of studies, and I'm dubious, but maybe. I think this is going to get clearer. This is really a case where I would not just rush to do anything different. I would look very carefully, try some. We got enough people doing different experiments. We will soon solve this. By September, this show is going to look very different, and I guarantee you it will look different in the late fall, because by then you will have had lots of universities reopen, whether or not they should have, in the US or the UK, and then we'll see what happens. I'm not touting this as a wonderful way to proceed. It's probably, but it's going to happen. You might as well just have to just look at evidence here.
Can I
Thank
ask
you, Tom. Ugo, there is a question by Mariella Pittari, okay, and then you go after Mariella, okay? Mariella.
Sorry, Professor Ugo. Hi, Professor Ferguson. So my question is, are we entering in a new social contract, a new covenant, let's say, because people who are starving, the blue collars, as you said, are really willing to renounce their basic rights, either of freedom or privacy, to be able to earn their wages and in order to survive. And in this case, how do you think that this issue would play in the next elections? I mean, worldwide, and especially in the US, because it's coming soon. Thank you.
Oh God. Yes, well, look, I trust nobody thinks I'm advocating for grinding down blue collar workers. I think the whole point of my discussion has been, don't do that, because that's the weight of the existing machinery, if you like, is doing precisely that, right? I mean, that really, and especially migrants, I think that is really, you got to do something here. Now, how's this going to play in elections? Oh God, what I myself think, again, that the election, it depends when the elections are. If you're talking about the United States, well, my colleagues, Paul Jorgensen, G. Chen, and I, we put up a piece, 3 graphs on the 2020 election, on the INET webpage. And we looked there, and one thing we could see was this huge surge in Democratic turnout in 2018. Turnout rose a lot. How much you'd sort of have to be way into the weeds on American election facts to really appreciate. But my sense is that there is a very deep and profound revulsion against many of the policies that the Trump administration's produced. There is also a cultivated reaction on the other side, too. And in the US, political money is massively important, and I think my colleagues and I have shown that it really matters. I think we have finally settled the question in a piece in the, it's actually edited partly out of Italy, Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, where we are able to get rid of alternative reasons other than money. It's not, the money was not following polls. We can actually show that. And in other words, you get the money and you can move votes. How many can you move? On the, we'll all have to find out there. I think there's a reasonable chance. It's not a given. And I mean, many folks have said, God, maybe the Democrats are going to actually nominate the only Democrat who could lose to Trump. I'm not sure that it is going to actually be that story. He may be moving to a situation as in 2008, where, you know, as the world collapsed, Obama didn't have to do much of anything except not be a Republican to win. But that's in the future. I do think that I want to repeat just how much we're going to learn in the next 3 or 4 months about lots of things. The death tolls keep rising as people keep opening. It's going to have a really chilling effect on folks, and people who champion early reopening are going to look really bad. I do think that that will hit. You get, I mean, in some countries, I think there are already signs of that reaction. So I'm afraid I want to be somewhat cautious, but I agree that maybe I could say this, right? The natural instinct of much of the natural political momentum of a lot of what's going on in the coronavirus crisis is to make authoritarian states more possible, either privately or publicly. And in the US case, you're likely to have a weaker public state and a stronger private authoritarian state. In particular, a point I've directed some attention at, and you need to think about this over in Europe too. Right now, the discussion about the World Wide Web and the use of the web to track people is between states and citizens mostly. Employers are, I suspect, going to be forcing that on their employees. And then the question of what your private laws and labor laws allow you to do is going to be really, really important there. And I think that is a major front for folks to think about. Because they're in the US, I can tell you, and I'm sure in the UK too, roughly the initial position is going to be, yeah, all right, that's states and citizens. But you know what? If you want to work here, you got to wear this thing and it will broadcast your mood and everything else. The other side of this is that, you know, it needs a more careful discussion. I didn't have time to do it. Is if you notice, with almost no publicity, Facebook finally set up what it was sort of I can't remember the term. It was in effect what I was calling its Supreme Court. If they threw you off Facebook, you could appeal to it. If you look at those folks, I mean, in effect, since they're a major channel, this is equivalent to a kind of public utility being operated totally in private. And you know, I agree with some of the German assessments, which are generally more outspoken than the American ones or the UK ones, which is that, you know, when you study closely there, these guys are not necessarily going to do anything, even if you complain. And the folks on them, in my opinion, although some of them profess strong free expression views, I'm a little dubious about others. And you know, the notion that you can operate privately to control a channel that big, you know, if I were saying, look, if you're looking for work in law and society, boy, is this topic worth discussing, because it's happening now. It's already there. And Twitter is developing some of the same things. They just cut people in and out of their space. And on what basis is just not clear to me.
Thank you, Hugo. Hugo, unmute yourself.
Okay, particularly this last part of your thoughts is very interesting to me, and I would like to try to develop a little bit on this notion that when something is too important and impacts so much areas of citizenship and political possibilities, it becomes common, it becomes public, whatever you want to call it, but certainly cannot be run as a private interest, okay? And this is a very, very important and very serious point, because these matters of censorship on Facebook, and on YouTube and on many of those is actually hitting particularly everybody who is talking and discussing the issue of vaccines. And this actually makes emerge all sorts of possible suspects that you might call them conspiracy theory, whatever you want. But I do believe that there are some important reasons to take very seriously those kind of concerns and the dramatic conflicts of interest that emerge at the World Health Organization over and over again, and the dramatic amount of money that people like Bill Gates and other strong Democrat supporters are putting into those kind of institutions, and who are going to be the winners and the losers of capitalism moving online. All of those are things that have to be addressed with a very, very hard-nosed look, because it might be all conspiracy ideas, but I would use some sort of a Rawlsian argument from this point of view. When he was talking about Maximin, and he would say, well, if you have to organize something like the Normandy, arriving in Normandy with the army, you might want to ask your meteorologists whether it's going to be good or bad weather, but you have always to consider, if you are a good leader, or if you are someone that wants to understand, you must always consider that even if your meteorologist said that the weather is going to be okay, it might be actually a tsunami situation. Okay, so you have to consider always that something might be much worse than it reasonably appear. Okay, so I'm extremely worried when we sort of get, as a matter of course, the idea of let's hope that someone invent a vaccine, without putting at the center of our analysis the property rights structures and the kind of tremendous incentives to violate the most fundamental individual rights of privatized vaccines and other kind of healthcare measures, and the willingness of government to abridge individual rights in order to make these things compulsory. Those are actually things that would require very clearly that everything that is related to this kind of crisis be put in the commons. There should be a fundamental decision at the international level that vaccines of other things that are related to this particular crisis have to be put in the commons, that we should not have any kind of incentive of economic nature to develop those kind of things, because otherwise the results are going to be possibly even worse than the cure. And we already know that it's very unlikely that vaccines work for flus, for example, because these viruses change very fast. So it's very likely that we are going to get someone who comes up claiming that it's a vaccine with very limited kind of precaution and experimentation because of the state of the emergency. There might be government that compel that on people, and all of that out of tremendous amount of money that can be made by those that own the trademark and on those kind of vaccines. So I think that there should be a moratorium on intellectual property on these things, and there should be some sort of very clear position by every kind of person that has responsibilities to think and no actual conflict of interest, to come up very clearly that property rights in these kind of things do create incentives that are distorted and potentially very dramatic. I want to know what you think about that.
Well, I basically just agree. Now, I would observe that, you know, at INET, my own institution, we have been supporting Bill Lazonic and his colleagues' work on the big pharma's business model, and a whole string of papers on the problems there. My colleague Arjun Jadev co-authored a paper with Joe Stiglitz recently on this. But I also just made a grant directly on the question of patent rights and of the type you're talking about to one Tala Saeed. A legal analysis, I think you all know. No, we are very alert to this problem, and we are working very actively on it. More broadly, in the last year or two, you know, I spent a considerable time pushing on research in the internet antitrust issues. I mean, Mark Glick's papers and I think Dina Cervenison's are really excellent, and they've had I think a fairly wide influence. There's more to be said, but I don't disagree at all. I can't imagine how you could be allowed to privatize a vaccine that can help the world, particularly at a high price. You're going to have to cover costs, but most of the costs are almost certainly going to have come from some previous government grant, one way or the other. And no, I think the whole the existing structure of legal rights on this is obviously crazy. I think the neoliberal rewrites of patent laws are awful. I've actually tried to stimulate a substantial amount of research on this question.
Good.
Thank you. And of course, there is the green question, and Daniela Carosio is going to ask that question now. Daniela?
Okay, thank you very much for this presentation. It was very, very interesting. I'd like to, to introduce the question of climate change systemic risk. We had with the COVID-19, how can I say, first evidence of, how a pandemic or systemic risk is going to generate so many problems. What do you think about the fact that there are pension funds, responsible investors who are managing pensions, foundations, funds, who are thinking climate change is going to have a very big impact also on the economy and on their portfolios. The fact that COVID, we hope, is going to be a short-term shock, if we can say 1.5 year, 2 years, a short-term. But climate change is going to be irreversible. So do you think that investing in a sort of a Green New Deal, in a coordinated way, is going to be difficult, but at national level probably is going to be a way out, to the big depression resulting from COVID-19. And also correlated question is maybe it's another big issue, but what about tax? You think the tax system is going to be reformed in order to cope with the huge debt, government debt?
Well, all right, couple of things. On the Green New Deal issue, can you hear? I guess, okay. On the Green New Deal issues, I actually pretty much agree with my good friend Serva Storm. We published his paper critical of the Green New Deal proposals from the European Commission. And, you know, they're basically heavily watered down. I think that's clear. I also think, though, that there is more space for induced innovation, that can proceed a good deal faster. I think Michael Grubb's co-authored paper for us is quite striking on that point. But I'm not claiming to know this material. I am sure that the basic problems with all Green New Deal issues are less purely theoretical ones than they are the practical problems of political money. I mean, that just kills action in the United States. It has a major influence in Europe. You know, countries, if you don't have a major oil company sitting in your polity, probably have an easier time dealing with some issues, etc. But if you got coal, well, that's I think if you like, rational green change as quickly as possible is pretty vital. And so I don't myself think, I am extremely skeptical about some of the financial proposals put forward. I don't generally like climate bonds where when you study those, it turns out that a lot of financial houses like to promote those because they don't tell you, but they, in a normal market, we're not in a normal market. We haven't been in one for a while, and we're not going to be in one for some time. But in a normal market, what they're really thinking is you can add the costs of, if you like, making the bonds profitable for the houses that issue them on top of the costs of doing whatever it is you're supposed to be doing with the bonds. I would prefer direct approaches. You can do it for nothing. I've had people, although I run into people who occasionally dispute it. It seems pretty clear that periodically Chinese banks get told you need to do some climate loans. I'm not saying they've done anything like it enough. Just go visit Beijing and or Shanghai, and you'll get some the limits of that policy. But I wouldn't mind just telling banks, look, you're going to have to make green loans, or you're just not going to be able to loan. That's much cheaper than paying people to float bonds. I think Servas's remarks on proposals by guys like Jeff Sachs and so forth are right on the money, to make a bad joke. There. So now, and in general, I am not persuaded that finance is so wonderful in setting this. I think it's clear, some of Grubb's work shows this, I think, very clearly. You can do a lot with direct regulations, especially in construction and things like that over time. If you just tell them you're going to have to do renewable energy and so forth, you can do that. Smart electric grids can, in the US, we don't have a lot of this stuff. It's political. Most climate problems, I think, are less problems of we don't know what to do. We got a fairly good ideas in many cases of what to do, but they're blocked by basically political money. That's the real story here. And most of the climate discussion goes on at, if I may put it slightly metaphorically, it goes on in the ionosphere when it should be going on much lower down, only a few hundred feet above the Earth's surface. That's the major problems in climate, in my opinion.
Okay, Thank you, Professor Ferguson. Thank you all for this very lively debate. Let me remind you of our next pandemic lecture. Wednesday next week, we shall have Yanis Varoufakis on power in the post-pandemic age. I'll see you all there. Ciao.